This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to our Decalogue lecture by His Excellency Archbishop Wilton D. Gregory. It's a great privilege to have all of you here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is John Whitty. I serve as director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, a co-sponsor of our forum this evening. Our center is dedicated to studying the religious dimensions of law, the legal dimensions of religion, the interaction of legal and religious ideas, institutions, methods, and practices. Working with some 90 faculty from around the Emory campus and some 1,600 scholars from around the world, the Center sponsors advanced research projects and publications, senior fellowships and clinical internships, special courses and degree programs, and a variety of public forums such as this one. With this evening's event, our Center begins a series of special public forums entitled When Law and Religion Meet. Over the next 2 years, we shall be bringing to this lectern distinguished religious leaders to discuss how state law challenges their religious communities and how their religious communities might in turn challenge state law. In this lecture series, we shall be confronting some of the hardest legal, political, and moral questions that face us today. Questions of life and death, of war and terror, of faith and freedom, of church and state, of marriage and family, and much more. We shall be summoning the best wisdom of our religious traditions in hopes of finding new ways to think about our lives together as persons and peoples, as citizens and believers, as consumers and stewards of what we've been given. Several spring events noted on your program will explore these questions in Islamic and Protestant communities, and next year we aim to bring leaders from the Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, and Native American worlds to continue our conversation with you. The Decalogue lecture that we shall enjoy together this evening is one of our center's most distinguished public forums. It was established by Dr. Marion Leathers Kunst in memory of her late husband, Paul Grimley Kunst, a beloved professor of philosophy and a world authority on the history of the Decalogue, or Ten Commandments. Our Law and Religion Center is deeply honored to co-sponsor this evening's lecture with our friends and colleagues at the Aquinas Center of Theology at Emory University. The Aquinas Center has proved to be a rich source of Catholic theological and social teachings on this campus and has sponsored professorships, lectureships, internships, and much more that have collectively leavened and enlightened our learning considerably. I am privileged to introduce the new director of the Aquinas Center of Theology, Dr. Philip M. Thompson, who will chair our proceedings this evening. Dr. Thompson holds degrees from Vanderbilt and DePaul, as well as his JD and his PhD from the University of Georgia and the University of Chicago, respectively. With wide-ranging interests in comparative ethics, religion and science, moral theology, and jurisprudence, he is ideally placed to continue the leadership of the Aquinas Center, so ably masterminded this past year by our Emory friend and colleague, Dr. Dana Green. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Thompson to introduce His Excellency and the Decalogue lecture. Philip.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank John Whitty for inviting us to be a co-sponsor with the internationally renowned Center for Law and Religion here at Emory. It is our distinct pleasure at the Aquinas Center of Theology to be a part of this process and to help facilitate that. In that regard, I would want to thank specifically somebody, the vice chair of our board of directors who helped make this happen, Joe Foltz, who began the process of exploring how we might be able to participate here tonight. As John mentioned, the Aquinas Center of Theology does a number of things on campus. We try to bring the Catholic scholarly presence to the campus at Emory and to bring Emory professors out to the parishes in the Archdiocese. So it's a collaborative process between us and Emory and the community at large. I am particularly glad tonight that the Archbishop is here because 15 years ago, when I was doing a fellowship on law and religion, I had studied the Catholic relationship to the death penalty historically. I was invited one night to join a group of 15 to 20 lawyers and judges who were Catholic, and it was a very sort of relaxed affair at somebody's home. We had a lovely meal, and I gave a talk of about an hour on this topic. In the last 5 to 10 minutes, I mentioned the position of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and Pope John Paul II, suggesting that we needed to take a new look at our position on the death penalty. When I finished, and what had previously been a very amicable group suddenly turned very hostile. I had the feeling, you ever seen those movies like in Frankenstein where the villagers have the torches and the pitchforks? Suddenly I was confronted with that sort of sensation as I looked out at this group who were all angry at me, and really not so much me as the church as a whole for its position. So it's only taken me 15 years to realize that really I can just sit back and let somebody who's a much greater authority come before you and explore this very complex and difficult issue. And it is a difficult issue both for our church, for all the laity in our church who are struggling on this issue. There's a deep division on this issue. So this is a very timely and difficult issue that we're going to attempt to deal with tonight. Fortunately, we have a very able person to help us with this. The Archbishop was born in Chicago, went to Catholic schools there, became a priest in the 1970s, went on to receive his PhD at the Pontifical Liturgical Institute at San Anselmo in Rome. Subsequent to that, he's held a number of positions as a bishop and as an archbishop in Atlanta since 2005. He is well known as the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. When he came on board to that job, he had the unfortunate task of having to confront the sex abuse scandal with the clergy, which resulted under his leadership, though, in the Charter for the Protection of Children, which we all hope is going to be very successful in the years to come. So he's no stranger to difficult issues. He tackled that one. He's been tackling the death penalty. In February of 2007, he was at the Georgia State Capitol held a press conference there to call for a moratorium on the death penalty. He has written letters to the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole, asking them to please show clemency in a number of death penalty cases, including the one that's recently been in the paper of Troy Davis. But he also, and this may be of interest to you, he celebrates Mass twice a year for prisoners at the state prison in Jackson, including death penalty inmates who were there. So he both approaches this issue from a standing of a teacher in the church, but also as a pastor who is dealing with this very, very difficult issue. It is my great pleasure, and I think you're in for a very interesting lecture, and followed by a question and answer session, which I'll help to moderate afterwards. So it is my pleasure to welcome our Archbishop, Wilton Gregory.
Thank you, Phil, for that warm and gracious invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin by thanking the Emory Law School and the Aquinas Center for inviting me to discuss one of the important life issues confronting American society today, and for the opportunity to articulate the present and traditional stance of the Catholic Church regarding the use of the death penalty. I address this issue not as an expert on civil jurisprudence, nor as a specialist in criminal justice, but as a pastor and teacher of the Catholic Church here in Atlanta, which is united to a religious tradition spanning 2,000 years of history. Let me approach what is distinct about my own church's engagement with the issue of capital punishment by referring to an historical anomaly that occurred in the 1990s. As some of you may know, the Catholic Church approved in 1992 its first universal catechism in over 4 centuries. In the words of Pope John Paul II, this text serves as a full, complete exposition of Catholic doctrine, enabling everyone to know what the Church professes, celebrates, lives, and prays in her daily life. In the short span of time between the first edition of the text and the final official Latin version issued in 1997, the section pertaining to the death penalty was significantly revised. What brought about this change in the catechetical presentation of the Church's moral position? The key distinction between the original and the official versions of the Catechism's exposition of the morality of the death penalty is the way in which the purposes of punishment are defined. We see that in the provisional, or first edition, the section on the death penalty upheld a traditional Catholic principle, namely, the right and duty of legitimate public authority to punish malefactors by means of penalties commensurate with the gravity of the crime, not excluding, in cases of extreme gravity, the death penalty. The 1992 text then asserts that, and I quote, "The primary effect of punishment is to redress the disorder caused by the offense," close quotes. Finally, it states, and I quote, "If bloodless means are sufficient to defend human lives against an aggressor and to protect public order and the safety of persons, public authority should limit itself to such means, because they better correspond to the concrete conditions of the common good and are more in conformity to the dignity of the human person," close quote. The earlier edition of the Catechism retains the traditional teaching of the Church, permitting the use of capital punishment to defend life and to protect public order, thereby redressing the disorder caused by the offense. The preference for the use of bloodless means is in line with the whole tradition of the Church, because even in lawfully carrying out justice for the sake of society, Christians are called to show mercy and not vengeance. When the second edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church appeared in 1997, some readers were surprised to discover that the purpose of capital punishment as restitution of public order had been removed from the discussion. In addition, the corresponding notion of capital punishment as deterrence to further capital crimes was also reduced. Between the publication of the first edition and that of the official Latin version, Pope John Paul II had issued an important encyclical letter entitled On Human Life, Evangelium Vitae, in 1995, that took up a number of moral issues related to the defense of human life and dignity, including the death penalty. It appears that the late pontiff's analysis on capital punishment had an impact on the Vatican Commission charged with overseeing the revisions of a teaching instrument that is normative for the moral discernment of the Church's 1.1 billion Catholics. Once the 1997 version of the Catechism eliminated the protection of public order as an argument, the only justification for the deterrent value of capital punishment was that it defended human beings against an aggressor. In looking at the revised version of the text, one would have to conclude that the only purpose that would render an execution morally licit, according to Catholic teaching, is the defense of society from the particular criminal whose sentencing is under question. The new paragraphs conclude with an assertion taken directly from Evangelium Vitae that the United States bishops understand to imply, and I quote, a very restrictive application of the death penalty. The new text, based on John Paul II's moral analysis, maintains that, and I quote, the cases in which the execution of the offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Close quotes. It appears then that the revised Catholic teaching on capital punishment is closely associated with the influence of the late pontiff. One other point should be noted about these changes in the Catholic Catechism. By narrowing the permissible situations for the moral application of the death penalty, the editors of the Catechism also followed John Paul II's lead in reorienting the issue to the broader discussion of legitimate defense. The late Pope reasserts that the primary purpose of punishment is to redress the disorder caused by the offense, which includes rectifying the violation of personal and social rights. Yet punishment also provides the offender with the condition to regain the exercise of his or her freedom. In other words, the legitimate use of punishment to defend the order of justice should include remedies for both the victims and the perpetrators of crime. At this point, I would like to provide a brief review of the traditional teaching of the Catholic Church prior to the changes in the Catechism. The last decade was certainly not the first time the Catholic Church had taken up a consideration of the morality of the death penalty. The Catholic response to crime and punishment has been rooted in our biblically grounded convictions about good and evil, sin and redemption, justice and mercy. The opening chapters of the book of Genesis teach that every life is a precious gift from God. From the standpoint of both the Old and New Testaments, Christians affirm that human beings are created in God's image and redeemed by Jesus Christ, who himself was executed between two criminals. On the basis of the biblical witness, even the dignity of those who deny the dignity of others is itself a gift from God, rather than something that is earned or lost through malicious behavior. In looking specifically to the Old Testament, we must confront the fact that the law of Moses prescribes execution for at least 36 offenses. Biblical justification of capital punishment has led some Christians to argue that statements such as a life for a life, limb for limb, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, require that the death penalty be used for certain crimes. Some interpreters also identify certain New Testament texts as supporting the use of executions, as when Jesus refers to the Mosaic teaching that he who speaks evil of father or mother, let him surely die. Likewise, the fact that the good thief crucified alongside Jesus acknowledges the justice of his own death sentence has been enlisted as an argument favoring the use of the death penalty by Christians. The author of Hebrews attests that those who reject the Torah should be executed without pity. A deeper reading of these passages indicates, however, that the principal intent of the Mosaic statutes was to limit the retribution that could be exacted for an offense, and not to require a minimum punishment. Particular commands like the one found in Genesis 9:6, if anyone sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, have a poetic character that indicates an original purpose that was not legal in intent. Such verses convey a pedagogical purpose removed from the sphere of literal legal applications. Furthermore, it is a fundamental Catholic principle to read individual passages of Scripture in the context of the whole canon. While the Old and New Testaments admittedly include some passages that command taking the life of one who kills, the Jewish Scriptures and the teachings of Jesus Christ as a whole esteem the protection of human life, the practice of mercy, and the rejection of vengeance. We may recall that when Cain killed his brother Abel, God did not end Cain's life. Instead, he sent the murderous brother into exile, not only sparing his life, but protecting him by putting a mark on Cain, lest anyone should kill him at sight. When faced with the execution of a public sinner, Jesus exposes the network of malevolence that underlies the adulterous action of the woman who faces death by stoning. Attentive to moral prescriptions in Scripture and the example of Christ, Christian authors in the first 4 centuries, by and large, confirm the right and sometimes the duty of civil authorities to impose the death penalty for certain crimes. Had not St. Paul understood that the magistrate bears the sword for a divine purpose? Are they not ministers of God? Absent the prerogatives of the state to execute punishment for infractions against civil peace, society would descend into chaos. While many of the Church Fathers acknowledge the need to use force in shoring up the defenses against injustice, there was also resistance to allowing Christian believers to participate in state-sanctioned violence. Even in cases in which the offense was grave, eminent writers like Tertullian and Origen of Alexandria manifested a clear preference for mercy and an aversion to all punishment that invoked the shedding of blood. Following the Edict of Milan by Constantine in 313 and the rise of the Christian state, Christian authorities adopt a near unanimous support for capital punishment in delimited circumstances. Augustine of Hippo, for example, asserted that participation in war or in legal execution of criminals in no way contravenes the commandment, "You shall not kill." Yet the Latin doctor also maintained the necessity of purity of motive when carrying out a capital sentence. Acting as judge or executioner requires an interior disposition of remorse. In a similar vein, centuries later, Pope Innocent III sanctioned capital punishment so long as it was carried out with justice and not out of hatred, with prudence and not with precipitation. In an exercise of the Church's solemn teaching authority, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 promulgated that no cleric may decree or pronounce a sentence involving the shedding of blood, or carry out a punishment involving the same, or be present when such punishment is carried out. While deepening alliances between the ecclesiastical and civil realms led the Church to accept the participation of Christians in the process of executing criminals, popes and other bishops refused to permit the clergy and the monks from being directly involved in such activity. Drawing on Scripture, the scholastic doctor Thomas Aquinas argued that ecclesiastical courts and the state should refrain from using the death penalty except for very grave offenses such as murder and treason. Having reflected briefly on the historical attitudes of the early Christians and the Church of the Middle Ages, let us examine for a moment the recent history of this Catholic discussion. But let me first advert to something that may not be clear to observers of our Church's role in public life. We Catholic bishops participate in public policy discussions about matters like the death penalty because Christ's love for us lets us see our human dignity in full clarity and compels us to love our neighbors as he has loved us. In applying the mystery of our faith to the social and political issues of our time, Pope Benedict XVI asserts that the Church cannot and must not take upon herself the political battle to bring about the most just society possible. She cannot and must not replace the state. Yet, at the same time, she cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. While the objectives of church and state remain distinct, we believe that our faith has an important and reasonable voice in the moral debates of our time. The Church's mission in society and its primary task in this specific debate is to promote what we call a culture of life, in which every human being, whether innocent of wrongdoing or guilty of serious violations of the law, is nevertheless recognized to have an innate and inalienable value. It has been noted that after World War II, many European countries began to question a state's right to impose death on its citizens. In 1974, the United States Catholic Conference, the voice for the collective action of the American bishops, declared its opposition to the institution of capital punishment. Then, in 1976, the same year that the United States Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty after a moratorium of 4 years, the Papal Commission on Justice and Peace expressed opposition to its use. Over the last 30-plus years, the interventions of the United States bishops on the question of the death penalty follows a pattern similar to that of the Catholic Church in other regions. The intent has been the same, namely to limit, restrain, or end the use of society's ultimate punishment. Since the first comprehensive statement on capital punishment in 1980, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has continued to call for an end to the use of the death penalty in our country. In 1999, the bishops again made an appeal to abolish the death penalty, which was followed in 2000 by the document Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic perspective on crime and criminal justice. This latter statement concludes by recalling our call to end the death penalty. Most recently, in 2005, the bishops began a national campaign to end the use of the death penalty, which sought to educate Catholics and non-Catholics and to inform state and congressional legislators, as well as the courts, about the Church's teaching. In the 1980 statement, the bishops began by recounting the 3 court decisions which led to the resumption of capital punishment in the United States. We recognize that the values at play in the debate are those of highest importance: respect for the sanctity of all human life, the protection of innocent human life, the preservation of order in society, and the achievement of justice through law. The statement considered the 3 traditional justifications for punishment: retribution, deterrence, and reform. The bishops claim that the purpose of reform is not aided by capital punishment because the opportunity for a prisoner to reform is cut short. Considering deterrence, the bishops conclude that the death penalty defends society from the particular prisoner who committed the grave crime for which capital punishment is prescribed. Yet we also register serious doubt as to the deterrence value of executions in relation to those who might commit heinous crimes in the future. The 1980 statement highlights the questionable basis for this second justification, a critique that would continue to factor into the intramural Catholic discussion of later years. Finally, we bishops examine the argument based on the societal and individual need for retribution, which we also regard as unconvincing. Forms of punishment must be determined with a view to the protection of society and its members, and to the reformation of the criminal and his reintegration in society. We bishops of the United States conclude, therefore, that the imposition of the death penalty under the conditions of contemporary American society is not justified in view of the traditional purposes of punishment. Like other death penalty opponents, Catholic leadership has pointed to the systemic flaws in the application of capital punishment, including the well-documented economic and racial inequality that inheres in the trials and sentencing of capital offenders. We bishops have also pointed to the alarming number of mistaken convictions of men and women on death row who were later exonerated. Yet much of our attention in this discussion on the death penalty continues to focus on the deterrence rationale, since this aspect of the debate continues to be central to public debate. Already in 1980, we were on record as saying that the argument that executions deter potential offenders from committing capital crimes lacks empirical support. Against the backdrop of the already mentioned developments of the 1990s, which include the changes in the Catechism and the commentary of John Paul II, our Episcopal Conference continues to maintain that capital punishment deters only the potential crimes of those on whom it is carried out. it is clear to many observers that the Catholic Church has undergone a development in its teaching on the death penalty. Only in the last 40 years of its history has the Church come out against state-sponsored executions, except in highly delimited circumstances. Such a departure from previous teaching, which stretches back almost 2 millennia, is bound to invite controversy within the ranks of the Catholic faithful. One of the most prominent intra-Catholic debates in recent years was initiated at a conference at the University of Chicago in 2002. Two prominent American Catholic participants, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia and Cardinal Avery Dulles, took up the historical, moral, and legal dimensions of the issues which we have been discussing. The justice and legal scholar on the one hand, and the cardinal theologian on the other hand. And the cardinal continued their spirited exchange in a series of articles and correspondences that appeared in the journal First Things and the weekly National Catholic Register. Justice Scalia takes the position that the Church, which has always permitted the use of the death penalty, has changed its historic position in the already mentioned passages of the Catechism and John Paul II's Evangelium Vitae. Such alterations in traditional moral teaching, he argues, were imprudent, to say the least. Scalia challenges the core claim made by the late pontiff that the death penalty is morally permissible only, and I quote, when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society, and that, open quotes, today such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent, close quotes. In other words, the Pope ends up reducing the moral permissibility of capital punishment to those rare cases in which it is not possible to incarcerate someone safely and keep them from harming society. The claim that modern society is capable of protecting itself from violent aggressors may not be so clear-cut. Scalia cites the circumstances in which prisoners escape from prison or kill fellow inmates and prison guards. Apart from whether or other means of punishment are feasible or not, another and more fundamental principle is at stake. Catholic leadership appears no longer to allow capital punishment in order to defend society through deterrence, a principle which Justice Scalia says the Church has for centuries held to be morally binding. The Catholic jurist understands that this new teaching is no exercise of papal infallibility, nor does it compel faithful Catholics to render their assent to it. As a teaching of the authentic magisterium, it merely requires respect and thoughtful attention by the membership. Scalia goes on to say that if he believed the recent developments in teaching on the death penalty were substantively correct and also binding on the faithful as a matter of Catholic faith, he would have to decide whether to violate either his responsibilities as a judge or his commitment to the Catholic faith. If that were so, he would rather resign his office than face such conflicting obligations. However, since the new teaching is contrary to traditional Catholic moral reasoning, Scalia believes that he is not in such a predicament and can therefore remain both a Supreme Court justice and a Catholic in good standing. Unlike Justice Scalia, Avery Cardinal Dulles finds no rupture in the development of Catholic teaching on the death penalty. The Jesuit cardinal distinguishes between theological affirmations, which allow for the death penalty in certain circumstances, and their practical application to contemporary contexts. By virtue of their office, the Church's pastors receive the guidance of the Holy Spirit to apply the principles of justice to public policy on matters like the death penalty. When they do so on behalf of their faithful and the common good, they make a prudential application of these principles to the contingent circumstances of contemporary society. After recounting the history of the Church's position, Cardinal Dulles argues that when it comes to the death penalty, each of the traditional ends of the punishment carry a different weight. For example, defending against a particular criminal carries a greater weight than deterrence against criminals committing a similar crime in the future. Arguing with Scalia, the American cardinal affirms that the death penalty is not a violation of the right to life of a person who has committed a deliberate and heinous crime. Yet, while referencing the recent statements of the American bishops, Dulles contends, and I quote, "The magisterium is not changing the doctrine of the Church. Moreover, the Pope and bishops, using their prudential judgment, have concluded that in contemporary society, at least in countries like our own, the death penalty ought not to be invoked because, on balance, it does more harm than good." The Jesuit cardinal acknowledges that public executions might have a deterrent value were they to be painful, humiliating, and public. Yet such violent spectacles, which were condemned by the early fathers of the Church, certainly have a deleterious effect on the moral health of society. Dulles concludes by recognizing that because the death penalty is administered privately, and in most situations by such presumably painless means as lethal injection, it does not contribute to the deterrence of other criminals from capital crimes. Having reflected with you on the historical and contemporary positions of my church on this ever-present issue of public morality, I must now take up my own view as a Catholic bishop and an American citizen. It is clear to me that Avery Dulles, who follows the lead of my brother bishops, has the stronger case. The statements of the Supreme Pontiff and those of the American hierarchy over the last 40 years are by no means inconsistent with historical Catholic teaching on just punishment and the need to safeguard human life and social goods. As Dulles argues, opposition to the death penalty is contingent on context. The state has the right to defend against unjust aggressors, and in some limited cases may apply punishment by execution. The Church's pastors have recognized that to civil authorities belongs the duty to defend all human life, whether it is wantonly or unjustly, when it is wantonly or unjustly endangered. The particular aspect of capital punishment that has changed in contemporary society from centuries past is the claim that the punishment for capital crimes necessarily requires execution as a deterrent to other potential offenders. The bishops of the United States have expressed concern over the inconclusive studies on this matter, and the Commission revising the Catechism has left this issue out of the final version of the text. There is a growing belief that the idea that the death penalty prevents others from committing capital crimes is unfounded. The hard facts remain inconclusive, as researchers often disagree with one another. At a February 2006 hearing of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution titled An Examination of the Death Penalty in the United States, a researcher from Columbia University testified that the claims of a new deterrence fall apart under close scrutiny. These studies are fraught with numerous technical and conceptual errors. In addition, the Death Penalty Information Center provides a review of the most recent deterrence studies. In a series of academic responses to the studies which support deterrence, found in journals such as the Stanford Law Review and the Annual Review of Law and Social Science, prominent researchers attest that the way in which these positive studies have reached their conclusions are full of statistical errors and an imprudent use of evidence. A study in the Annual Review takes issue with the groundbreaking deterrence studies of the 1970s, which were used in justifying the reinstitution of the death penalty. While one report claimed that the execution of one offender saves the lives of 18 people on average, recent statistical analyses show that this study omitted key potential variables, such as murders that are crimes of passion and jealousy, which have little correlation to the deterrent impact of executions. Another report published by the Death Penalty Information Center shows the results of a survey of experts from the American Society of Criminology, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, and the Law and Society Association. An overwhelming, and I quote, majority did not believe that the death penalty is a proven deterrent to homicide. Over 80% of the social scientists surveyed believe that the existing research fails to support a deterrence justification for the death penalty. While John Paul II greatly influenced the development of the Catholic position on capital punishment, he also wrote and spoke passionately against the use of the death penalty in his homilies and speeches. On several occasions, he pleaded for clemency for individuals on death row in the United States. His challenge to our society in extending mercy, even where it appeared to the public as unwarranted, was articulated well during his 1999 homily at the Papal Mass in St. Louis, Missouri. The Polish Pope invited worshipers to join the new evangelization, which, and I quote, calls for followers of Christ who are unconditionally pro-life, who will proclaim, celebrate, and serve the gospel of life in every situation, even in the case of someone who has done great evil, close quote. He then called for a consensus to the end of the death penalty, which is cruel and unnecessary. The Holy Father's strong stance on the death penalty, like his call for mercy and protection of all human life, not only carries the weight of his ecclesial office, but it is backed up by his own personal witness. When John Paul II was shot in 1981, he experienced the unjust suffering of a victim. Such an assassination attempt, especially on a high-profile person, can still result in a death sentence for the perpetrator. Yet the Holy Father chose not to seek vengeance, or even what might be considered the maximal punishment under the law. Instead, the Pope gave the world a tremendous witness of mercy when he forgave Mehmet Ali Agha, the Turkish Muslim who had tried to assassinate him. The pontiff even went to pray with him in his prison cell, and later successfully lobbied with the Italian government to grant him a pardon during the Jubilee year of 2000. The same pontiff had offered a similar gesture of mercy during his visit to St. Louis in 1999. On the first day of the Pope's visit to the city, Darrell Meese, a convicted killer, was sentenced to die by lethal injection. John Paul II pleaded with Governor Mel Carnahan to stay the execution, and Meese's sentence was commuted to life without parole. while the state continued to execute its prisoners on death row following the papal visit, and this despite further requests by the Vatican to halt the death penalty regime in Missouri. The commutation granted by a government official to a death row prisoner attests to the moral force of the late pontiff's advocacy for a culture of life. In seeking to contribute to a civilization that promotes human dignity, the Catholic Church desires to strike a balance between the demands of justice and the need for the very acts of mercy that make it easier for people to practice compassion and justice. The Catholic moral tradition, as referenced in this presentation on capital punishment, shows an unambiguous preference to preserve life, even when the order of justice is threatened and the safety of innocent life is at stake, while acknowledging the moral and legal prerogatives of the state to execute criminals in strictly limited circumstances. The Church pleads for restraint in the exercise of that prerogative. The moral requirement to protect the innocent stands alongside the imperative to stem the cycle of violence that keeps individuals and communities enslaved to vengeance. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." As heirs to the vision of brotherly communion that Jesus Christ imparted to his disciples, we Catholic bishops long for an American society that is neither insensitive to the demands of justice nor blind to the need for mercy. As did our bishop forebearers in the ancient and medieval periods, we seek to make prudential application of the timeless principles of the moral law to the ever-changing circumstances of society. In this presentation, I have tried to show how the development in our teaching on capital punishment is consistent with our historic mission to preach the gospel and advance the common good of society. I am grateful, deeply grateful, to this university community for an opportunity to speak to this public discussion of critical importance for my own tradition of faith and in my capacity as the pastor of the Catholic people in North Georgia. I thank you, and I ask God's blessing upon you.
Thank you so much, Archbishop. There are two microphones. There's a microphone over here and one over here if you have a question. The only thing I would say to you, if you do ask a question, is please try to keep your question relatively short so that everybody can have a chance who wants to ask a question will have that opportunity. As I was listening to Archbishop, I was thinking, yeah, I really did need him 15 years ago. Would have been nice to have had that present. But we have it here tonight, and it's a great luxury to have that. And now we look forward to an exchange of question and answer. Please.
Good evening, Archbishop. I'm here at the behest of my mentor, John Whitty, who said that I have to ask you as many difficult questions as I've asked him. But please know that as a member of your church, and as you actually baptized and confirmed me a couple years ago, that it's that I'm putting to you a challenge from within. Okay. As opposed to critiquing the general prohibition of the capital punishment that John Paul the Great influenced into the later catechism, I'm more curious about and more concerned with actually the very narrow exception that he left. The idea that the intentional causing of another human's death as a means to protect the state seems at least in tension with the principle of double effect at work in self-defense and even defense of nations, that I can never directly intend the death of another individual. I can ward off that individual's aggression to any extent, and if the consequence of that is their death, then so be it, but that's a non-moral evil. It seems that the narrow exception that John Paul the Great has left still leaves the state with bloody hands under that line of moral theology, and I'm interested to know your opinion on that.
I think the narrow window that still is open has to be there because of the complexity of the world that we live in. I think obviously I wrote this as an American, living in our society with the advantages and the technological and the societal sophistication that we enjoy as a people. But the teaching has to be for the entire church, including those places that would not have the wherewithal that we have to ensure the safety of its people. So that's one of the caveats of trying to teach for the world universal. You cannot focus it exclusively on nations or societies that have advantages, possibilities, and safeguards that, say, people in other parts of the world do not have. And therefore, I think part of the caveat that's there, the caveat, that's my word, not necessarily the word that you use, but the window is there because there are places, perhaps, that could not, because of their circumstances, secure violent people in such a way that society would be protected. But that's part of the challenge of being a universal church.
Okay. Another question?
Yes, my name is Carl Kroger. I'm a student here at the Theology School, and I briefly just want to echo that concern this gentleman just raised. I think leaving an exception means that you leave room for violating the love commandment. On another note, I've been involved the past couple of weeks extensively on the work of the Troy Davis case. And as I was gathering signatures, as I was at marches and protests at the prison on the Capitol steps, one of the things that kept coming to my mind was, where is the church? Where are the Christians? And the question I want to pose to you is, why does there seem to be such a large disparity between the official church teaching and the positions of the bishops and the actual mobilization of the people in the church pews to fight against the death penalty? And that's not something unique to the Catholic Church.
Right. That's a very good question. And we bishops have asked that before. You know, in other words, why have, and I take the responsibility. I am the bishop of this local church. I have a certain responsibility in the teaching, in the munus docendi, in the promulgation of the faith, and I'm not universally successful. I have not moved the hearts of all of the faithful, not just in terms of capital punishment, but in terms of justice and other moral issues. Now, having acknowledged that our teaching has not always moved hearts, convinced people, removed all question and doubt, I also have to live with, as do you, the issue of original sin. I mean, we are all not enlightened angelic spirits who, once we see or hear the truth, are without doubt moved to accept the truth. We live in a world, we are broken people, which is why I have job security. We are not people who have completely embraced the gospel, completely understood the meaning of truth, and therefore we don't always respond with the kind of acceptance and clear application of the principles. But I'm also a man of hope. I see movement. I'm here in a city that in so many ways is identified with the whole civil rights movement. How long did it take? How long is it taking? I want to say did it take, I should say, is it taking to move human hearts in regard of respect for other people, for diversity and all of that. So if you're frustrated that the bishops are writing good stuff and the people aren't either getting it, accepting part of it, it's our frustration too. But it's a part of the human condition. But I have not lost hope that we may prevail. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amy Levad. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Ethics and Society program in the Graduate Division of Religion, and I'm a member of IHM Church on Briarcliff. For the past several years, I've been doing a fair amount of academic and activist work on the criminal justice system in general, beyond the death penalty. And one of my frustrations has been that the Catholic Church has a lot to say about the death penalty, and it's all very important. But we also have in this country 2 million people who are in prisons and jails, as well as 6 million people who are under probation and parole, which is the highest rate of state supervision in the world, as well as the highest number, so both per capita and in pure numbers. And I don't hear much from the church, either from the U.S. Catholic bishops, aside from responsibility, rehabilitation, restoration, or from lay activists, or from Catholic academics about these issues. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how church responses to the death penalty relate to church responses to the criminal justice system more broadly within this country.
It is, first of all, I don't disagree with anything that you've said. I accept it. In my office as the bishop, I receive regularly lots of mail, lots of communications that question why the church is not putting more emphasis on this issue or that issue or another issue. And most of them are legitimate in the sense that from the perspective of the author, more should be done, more must be done. But I'm also very much aware that while my responsibility as the bishop is to teach the faith, to witness the faith, to encourage the faith, I'm not a one-man show. Now, some people say bishops think they are a one-man show, but I'm not a one-man show. The church's mission and the church's teaching is a responsibility that we all share. I have a unique dimension of it, without a doubt. But the very fact that young people here at Emory and in so many other places are concerned about justice and the inequities in our penal system is an indication that the work will go forward. Now, should there be more homilies on it? I suspect you're right. Should there be more writing on it? I suspect you're right. But the very fact that lay people like yourselves and many, many others are invested in it is a great source of comfort to me as the bishop. While I was doing the research on this for this paper, I believe it was a number of law students in Chicago who spearheaded the whole background into the imposition of capital punishment and its inequities. Now, I'm sure the Archbishop of Chicago would love to have taken credit for it, but it was the lay people or the young people who were inspired and driven to implement the works of justice. And I think that has been the case in so many great social movements of our time. The bishops, the church, the folks that sit in the offices and pull the levers for the authoritative teaching, we can do so much, but we can't do everything. But I am very heartened to know that I'm not in this alone. And to be perfectly honest, the ultimate implication of social change, the implementation, is going to come from the laity. The church, the teachers of the church, the pastors of the church, lay down the principles, but we rely on the people that are in the marketplace to put them into action. Okay?
My name is Dan Rutz. I'm here at the invitation of my daughter, who is a third-year law school student here at Emory University. First, I want to thank you very much for a very excellent and therefore enlightening presentation, and ask you, please, about the one crack in the door that you've left open for the moral application, justifiable application of the death penalty. Do you think the church has an obligation to further define what that window might include, perhaps as a deterrent value for those who might violate that window, that you're truly on your own at that point without much sympathy from anybody, including the church, or for other reasons? And I'm not going to put you on the hook here to ask you what some of those examples might be, unless you have some in mind, which would be helpful if you do. But does the church have an obligation to further define what indications remain under the new restricted moral window that's been left?
I think we do have an obligation to pursue what the limitations are, and I think that is going on among the legal world. Those, not just those who happen to be Catholic, but those who happen to agree with this principle. I think that kind of conversation is going on to delineate exactly what would be the circumstances when this narrow window would be a legitimate course of action for the state. I've heard some, I alluded to some in Justice Scalia's, and I would not dare to say that I had probed the sophistication of his argument, but as he talked about prisoners who kill other prisoners, guards, or there's a circumstance in the state where they cannot guarantee that an individual would be securely maintained. But I think the legal world is still grappling with those. At least I hope it is. Again, this is one of those things I think the church can lay out the moral principles, but the application of those principles and the delineation of when those principles would be appropriate, I think, is taking place among the legal world as you talk about them, both for those who accept them as well as for those who would challenge them.
Archbishop Gregory, thank you for a great exposition of the Church's position. Surveys in this country from time to time have shown that a majority of people, generally in the order of 70 to 80%, favor capital punishment. But when given the alternative of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, that number drops to around 50%. What is the Church's position, since you did make reference to reformation of the prisoner, the Church's position on life imprisonment without the possibility of parole?
It would seem to me that the Church would, if we're going to advance as we have the narrow circumstances under which the death penalty might be permitted, we certainly have to accept the fact that a life sentence without the possibility of parole is a legitimate vehicle for punishment and for protecting of society. Now, I like yourself, well, I'm presuming that in your question was a certain doubt. What about individuals who have served, long, vast prison sentences and have demonstrated, a change of heart, remorse, et cetera, et cetera? Is the imposition of that kind of punishment, even in those circumstances, open to some modification? I would think that what prompts the people who changed in your description is the cavalier sentencing that we have in our own judicial system, where there doesn't seem to be a consistency. And so people may not be convinced that a life sentence really is a life sentence, because they've encountered so many situations where people have been sentenced and yet have been released. So it's the inconsistency, I think, that creates the ambivalence in the hearts and minds of others. I don't know if that adequately responds, but it's probably the best I can do at this time.
That's their usual concern.
Yes. Okay.
My name is Ben Anthony. I'm the Episcopal chaplain here at Emory, and many of the things that you've talked about in terms of and things that have come up in questions that are irritants towards change have been very occasional efforts in the sense of their essays or homilies or doctoral projects. And I was wondering if you could comment on a more ordinary irritant for change, and sort of comment on what resources you see in the liturgy of the Mass, which is celebrated perhaps on a daily basis, that witness to this culture of life and provide the resources and momentum towards realizing some vision of the culture of life.
Well, as Phil has alluded, my professional training is in liturgy. So you may be sorry that you asked that question. In celebrating the liturgy, there's a certain principle in Catholic worship that says that the liturgy itself, in its readings and its prayers and its structure, probes the whole panoply of faith. And that if you celebrate it well, and if you listen attentively to the readings and pay attention to the prayers and celebrate them with a certain decorum and reverence, the issues that confront us will come out. That it's not something that you have to impose upon them so much as you draw out of them. So, for example, in terms of the dignity of life, during the course of the liturgical calendar that we Catholics follow, there are multiple occasions during the course of that 3-year cycle when we can talk legitimately, not imposing something, but extracting something about the dignity of life, mercy, the injustice of human institutions. I mean, every Good Friday, if you want to talk about the justice of a criminal system, every Good Friday in the Catholic Church, we begin with the gospel. Jesus went out to the Kidron Valley as he's preparing for his passion, and he's going to end up as a prisoner, a criminal, and executed in a system that was blatantly and obviously unfair. So it's not something you have to impose. we have the Gospels of the Good Samaritan, and, I'm not going to go over it. So liturgically, I think, and again, I'm revealing my own bias as someone trained in it, liturgically, the liturgy offers us enough possibility in its very essence that we can extract lessons and teachings about life and its dignity and its importance and its sanctity. So you don't have to go and, as a matter of fact, I think you do an injustice to the liturgy when you go and you lay something on it that's not there. You just got to wait till it's there and extricate it. But it's all, I think its richness is strong enough to provide ample opportunities for us to speak about the dignity of human life, the dignity of the human person, mercy, compassion, justice. Okay? I think I'm about to get the hook. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I think the Archbishop deserves a fabulous round of applause.
Thank you.
We thank God that you have got job security, because we need you to teach us for many more times. Thank you for a wonderful address, for the wisdom and the mercy and the justice it showed. Thank you for vindicating your reputation as the great teacher of the Catholic faithful and of all the faithful gathered here in Atlanta and at Emory University. I wanted to get you in a good clapping mood, because we have a few people for whom we wish to clap, to thank them for their work in putting together this evening. We, of course, want to recognize and thank our friends at the Aquinas Center for lending their co-sponsorship to this event, Philip Thompson and Dana Green. I want to thank my colleagues in the Center for the Study of Law and Religion who have lent their expertise to this evening and choreographed every step of the way. I want to recognize April Bogle and Linda King, Amy Wheeler, and Anita Mann, as well as their assistants Grace Kim and Stacy Harwell, as well as our AV experts Scott Andrews and Corky Gallo. If you would recognize them, please. Center for the Study of Law and Religion caters not only to the mind but also to the stomach, and we have set for you a nice dessert that we hope you will partake of. We want to ask you, as you leave the auditorium, to take a peek at the program that you have. You'll see a white comment card in that program. It would help us a great deal in serving you better and apprising you of future events if you would fill that in and let us know how we can be a better service to you and how you heard about this event. We also commend to you forums that are coming up in the spring that we're sponsoring, and we welcome your suggestions about other events that we can sponsor. We have set on the table outside for you a number of pieces of literature which the Archdiocese has provided, which the Aquinas Center has provided, and which our center has provided. We hope that you will avail yourself freely of all of those. There are posters and books and brochures and other goodies which you can take home for your edification. I believe that the most substantive part of the evening we have just heard. There's a presidential debate, but that's not important. I think we heard the very best that we can of Catholic social and theological and ethical teachings, and I think we just have to give the Archbishop another very, very robust round of applause. Godspeed in your travels home, and please join us for dessert.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.